Hi, all. Good morning. Good morning. So this our series of lectures that carry on from, if you like, lecture one, or chapter one, and now we're in chapter four. Chapter two and three are wordy ones. We'll come back to those. But in terms of the theory and calculation bits, we're going to carry on with. With chapter four. So the very first thing we looked at in chapter four, if you go back, you'll see is activity-based costing, and we talked about activity-based costing as a refined version, if you like, of traditional absorption costing. Because you see, ultimately, again, what we're trying to do here is to bring those costs into the units as efficiently as possible. But I mean, this is all on performance management, and the early chapters look at costing in general. So what we're really talking about here is how do we refine our processes, get better processes, and if you like, allocate, apportion, absorb costs as fairly as possible. And how do we, in the end, if you like, minimize costs, and how do we deal with scenarios where we have resource issues? And this is what this is beginning to look like, throughput accounting. So throughput accounting comes along and sort of says to us that, listen, guys, sometimes you might have a scarce resource, and fundamentally, the first argument really here is that in a just-in-time environment the aim is to do this in a just-in-time environment. And I'll go back again just to why we arrived at this scenario. And fundamentally, think of it this way. When you have actually, I think I have a picture of a process. Imagine you have a process that looks like this, and you have this steel slab, as you can see, going through a series of processes, A, B, C. Now, imagine this furnace can take 1,000 slabs at once, and not at once, but it can go through 1,000 slabs, when I say at once, during the day. And this can take 1,000 as well. I mean, so literally slab goes in, goes in, comes out, goes in, comes out. Now, imagine you had a scenario where this normally could take, you can see there are 10 people here. Normally, these 10 people would ensure that you had these 10,000 slabs to go through, so you can then come down here and do what you need to do. But imagine these people were ill, so this could only take 500 slabs. So all you will have, really, ultimately, is a scenario where you'll have these 1,000 half-finished slabs sitting here waiting to be processed. So only 500 would go through, and you would have 5 partly finished work in progress. And ultimately, what we're really trying to argue here is that we don't want to keep this type of work in progress, because keeping this work in progress ties up money. We have money tied up. So the argument here is if we can identify who the bottlenecks are. So for example, in this scenario like I've just been talking about, the finishing mill is a bottleneck, and if we can identify that bottleneck, this could then give us some direction as to what we make. So if we can identify this bottleneck, we can then, of course, whilst we're trying to fix this, remember this is all very in the short term, because we don't expect people to be ill for a long time. If we do know they're going to be ill for a long time, well, we need to employ new people. So it's all very short term thinking. So the argument here is, well, don't make 1,000, make 500. So that you have 500 going in here, 500 going in here, and 500 coming in here. So it's really arguing that you're really only as fast as your weakest link. So that's kind of the thinking here. So you can see the issues here of efficiency almost, and sort of the argument therefore is, well, now that we know we have a scarce resource, how do we make the most, if you like, of this scarce resource, if you like? What do we do to try and make the most that we can? So one, we've discussed watching the process. Two, we're now arguing or just trying to work out how do we get the best out of a scarce resource, or when we have a limited resource available to us. Again, a just-in-time environment is very much part of what I was talking about earlier on, very much part of an efficiency, total quality management sort of scenario where we want to be doing things as efficiently as possible. So we've always, once upon a time, you might remember the idea of contribution. So you will have sales revenue, or sales revenue minus variable costs equals to contribution. This is nothing new. Now, what throughput is really arguing is that, well, actually, in reality, Labor is if you like, a fixed, relatively fixed costs, because we have salaries, and we have almost like contracts. So this is not really variable. So it's really telling you to focus on the only key variable cost as material in the short term. Think about in the day, that sort of thing. So so this is the first thing. So really the argument then becomes, we can then work out what throughput, if you like, or if you like technically you could almost argue what contribution, about what output, output really is per process, if you like. So again, I like to think about it this way. Think about it, you can have a number, you're trying to make a number of products, A, B, C, and D, and then going through all these processes. You might have a bottleneck, right? And you might have a bottleneck. Now the question has to be that when A goes through this process, how much comes out? How much of A do we have coming through based on its sales revenue and its direct material based on that bottleneck, if you like? So I'm making a series of products, all going through a process, having to hit this bottleneck. And then I need to ask the question, well, who is going to give me the greatest throughput, so to speak, when they hit the bottleneck? And that's kind of the theory here. And of course, I would produce in the order of who gives me the greatest throughput, if you like, when I hit that bottleneck, ultimately. Right, so that's kind of the general principle here. So let's carry on. So a couple of points. So I just highlighted already. The variable cost of direct materials in a just-in-time environment is not cost of sales. I focus that it is just material, because again, like in a just-in-time environment, you must remember that we are not really holding any inventory. The whole idea is that we have good value chains in place, good networks in place, well integrated. So the value chains of our suppliers are very much integrated into our value chain, where we have good connections, where once our inventory starts falling, we have signals going out to our suppliers, who are able to then send us in the inventory that we need. So really throughput is just purely the difference between sales revenue and the direct materials associated with that coming through. And again, like I say, the aim is to get throughput as high as possible. I've highlighted this issue of a constraint or a bottleneck in a process, for example, and typically that bottleneck might be machine hours or labor hours, as you saw earlier on. And ultimately, I highlight this earlier on in all the questions you're always looking at. The question here is that we might have total demand. This is really critical, total demand, and the bottleneck is the one that there aren't enough of it, there isn't enough of it to achieve that demand, right? So we might have 1,000 units being demanded, but you might only have enough hours to make 800 units. But here you might have, in this other section, you might have 1,300 hours, if you like, in this other process. So you have two processes here. This is the bottleneck. So your aim is, well, what's demand? What are people requesting as demand? Can we meet it? And so that's how you work it out. And then, of course, you then work to that bottleneck, obviously. When I say work to that bottleneck, you now have a series of products going through, and your aim is to make sure that it is the product that gives you the highest throughput, if you like, per bottlenecked resource that we produce. Right, the only total variable cost in the short term, again, I've highlighted this, is the raw. What I'll do is I'll stop after every 10 minutes. I want to, so that you can have short breaks. And we agree the direct labor is not a variable cost. So in effect, throughput becomes something that looks like contribution, but we don't think of it like that. We just ignore direct labor. I've gone through this. This is your classic process, for example. And we have this kind of scenario. I've already discussed this issue of bottlenecks here. Right, I think this is a good place to stop, and then we'll come to the next video, and then we'll do the exercise.